Good morning, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the World GBC webinar on Better Places for People. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Michelle Malanka, Vice President with the World Green Building Council. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here to our first Better Places for People webinar. I'd like to share that in looking at our registrations this morning, we found that we have actually people from over 20 countries registered for this webinar, so we're excited to be sharing this with you. And we strongly encourage you to participate and ask us questions via the chat box, which should be in your toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen. I'd also like to say to everyone, happy World Green Building Week. If you don't know, this is World Green Building Week, and we celebrate it every year at the end of September. And it's typically celebrated with hundreds of events in dozens of countries. Last year, we had well over 200 events. We're on track for hundreds more actually this year. And last year we had over 40 countries participating, and we expect to see the same again this year. So this is a very exciting time for us, and we're happy to have our event be a part of World Green Building Week this year. Today we want to share with you our latest work on health, well-being, and productivity in buildings, and talk about why green buildings make better places for people. You'll find out, we're going to tell you a bit about this campaign. We're going to talk about the impact of buildings on health and well-being, what it means for you, what it means for your business, and what you can do to start to manage this. First, I'd like to start by introducing two others who are going to join me in this webinar. First is Beth Ambrose. She's Associate Director with JLL in London. Beth is the chair of our office's working group. It's our group of experts that we have assembled to do a deep dive into the offices sector. And I'd also like to introduce Richard Francis with the Monomoy Company. And he's both working closely with us to drive the work of the office's working group, and also he's leading our work on the retail sector. Both Beth and Richard are based in London, and I am based in San Francisco, which is why I just refer to it being the morning time, because it is. Before we get started, I'd like to do just a little bit of housekeeping. The presentation, our part where we share information with you, is going to take about 40 minutes. And after that, we'll be having the period where we answer questions. And we definitely want lots of interaction. And so I suggest going ahead and as questions come up for you, entering them into the chat box on the right, and if I can answer them quickly, I will. Otherwise, we'll collect them and we'll field them at the end at the end of the period where we start to take questions. So with that, I would like to go ahead and carry on with our presentation. This is today's meeting agenda. And again, we're going to find out more about what this campaign is. What is the Better Places for People campaign, and where did it come from? We're going to talk about how you can measure the impact of health, well-being, and productivity in your buildings for offices and retail. And we're going to touch a little bit on the residential sector, which we are covering in this campaign, which we'll dive into in the coming months. We're going to specifically talk about how you can drive change within the office workplace with regard to the physical environment and the different players that impact the physical environment, and how we're looking at they might be able to better work together. We're then going to talk about more specifically the retail environment and the set of metrics that we have proposed for this area, for this sector as well. And then we're going to talk about what's next for this campaign, and we think for health, well-being, and productivity in buildings more broadly. So let's talk about where this campaign came from. So back in 2013, March of 2013, the World GBC released a report on the business case for green building, and that covered several different aspects of the business case, and it only looked at the best peer-reviewed research on the business case. Looked at things like asset value, rental premiums, sales prices. It looked at design and construction costs and a lot of factors that contribute to this business case. It also had a chapter related to health and well-being in offices, and looked at, we thought, the top research at that time. And kind of really to our surprise, the chapter that everyone was most interested in wasn't asset value, for example, but really it was around this issue of health, well-being, and productivity in the workplace. And immediately we had lots of requests, both from our member green building councils around the world and from the industry, asking for more information. Was there more research? Is there more recent research? and we decided we needed to take it forward. And so we, last September, during Rural Green Building Week, in fact, we released the Health, Wellbeing, and Productivity in Offices report. And that's the slide you see right there. This report is available on the World GBC website, worldgbc.org. It is also available as an app. If you have an Android device or an iPad, you can go to your App Store and look up this report. It's basically an electronic version of the report, an ebook, but it also has links to research, and it has some additional research and some additional case studies as well. So it's a little bit different, a little enhanced from the online version. So we knew we wanted what we wanted the next steps to be, and so we issued this report. And what I'm going to do now is go over to Richard Francis and ask him to talk about some of the details of this report. Both Richard and Beth were very involved in the development of the Health, Wellbeing, and Productivity report that came out last year. Rich, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you all for attending this webinar. Essentially, you'll see in this slide and the one to follow, the way we decided to do the report was to look at a number of limited design features which had been well established in the literature, talking about the indoor environment and its effect on people, primarily because we believe, as the report notes, that the business case for sustainability is about people. Even though asset values can be related to things like energy performance and some other items, we thought that the real business case was around these things. And so the first part of the report was essentially looking into the literature on this and looking at the evidence around a defined number of categories which are within the design features. So things like indoor air quality would take into account VOCs and CO2. Thermal comfort, I think, is straightforward. Daylighting and lighting, biophilia and views, and so on. Essentially what we were finding was a relationship between what the design features would be and the productivity and the health and well-being of the occupants within that building. Michelle, if we could go to the next slide, I'd like to spend some time on that if I could. What makes this report a little bit different, and I think when it came out, what people really latched upon was not making the business case in a conventional way. So even though there had been a lot of literature around the design features and increases in health, well-being, and productivity, what this report tried to do was to make it very simple, to provide a framework, which you see now in front of you, which looked at the physical factors, which were on the previous slide, but also looked at individuals' perceptions of the office. Because one of the difficult things when you look at design features and you look at financial or productivity is there's not always a direct relationship. And as you get into this further on, you realize that actually as important as the physical features of the building are people's perceptions of that. So it's quite possible to have a building which, according to those design features on the previous slide, looks pretty good. But when you ask people about the working environment and how it relates to them and how they feel about it, you can get quite different results. So essentially we put together this three-pronged strategy, which was encouraging occupiers within organizations to begin to look and make some of the connections between the physical environment, how people perceived that environment, and ultimately how well the business was doing. And essentially what we thought we would be able to find would be some correlation among those 3 points of the triangle if we provided some guidance around what might look like some good practice, particularly with regard to the physical. Now, having said that, if we can move on to the next slide, Michelle. Some of the physical aspects that we asked organizations to consider are more objective than others. And so things like CO2 levels and ventilation rates and temperature and humidity that you see there on the left-hand side of the screen, all quite objective, all quite things that organizations around the world, and they can be different, present sort of different benchmarks around these, but it's quite clear to be able to measure some of those. And so that's consequently why we think they are a bit more objective. We're also asking occupants and people, more than occupants actually, the entire industry for that matter, to begin to assess some other things which don't necessarily fall so much into an objective category, but are important nevertheless, and relate back to how people perceive the environment. So things like visual comfort, ergonomics, active design certainly is a big one, views out and so forth. So there are objective and subjective measures that we're asking people to assess as part of the physical environment. I think the most important part of this can be found on the next slide, because what we realized, if we started asking people to take more measurements of the physical environment, it had to be clear to them why they were doing that. And so what gives this report, what gave the report, I think its warm welcome, was a low cost of entry and a potentially high return. So what we're asking organizations to do as part of that financial metric, which was on the lower right-hand part of the triangle on the previous slide, was to look at data that they were capturing already. Because if there was a relationship between the environment and the business success, well, that should be apparent, and it should be apparent in the kind of things that matter to most organizations, whether or not really they're interested in looking at the environment. And so we were asking companies in the terms of measuring productivity or the business case to look at data which they were already collecting or could collect easily. What we did find subsequent to the report is really quite interesting, and we didn't realize this at the time, which is almost all organizations collect data that's on the right-hand side. So they have data about staff retention and revenue, certainly about medical complaints and costs and physical complaints. But very seldom were they doing this kind of data collection on an asset-by-asset basis. So the idea behind the financial metrics was relatively straightforward. Most organizations would have access to this data. And if there was a relationship between the environmental or the design features that we're asking them to look at, then it should be apparent to them. A completely different kind of business case, asking organizations to look at their people and at their buildings. And it's important in this that organizations conducting this, any organization can do this, and we're arguing any organization should do it, because you know your people and you know your buildings actually better than anyone. And if there's a business case to be made, you're going to uncover it in your own assets with the kind of data that you'll be finding if you just use 6 or 7 outcome metrics and run them against the design features that we were talking about on the previous slide. The report, because it made the data accessible, because it didn't try to make a business case in the abstract, if we could go to the next slide, Michelle, had quite a lot of good press, and a lot of organizations, they understood this, and you can see there in front of you, this was a report, as Michelle mentioned, that had some good legs to begin with. People were interested in this, but I think we're all pleased and delighted by the reception that it had and has had since then, because this is a sort of different kind of model for organizations to take upon themselves, to use the data that they have or they could get easily, to make a convincing business case to themselves, which is highly personal in nature. If there's a relationship that exists, and we argue pretty strenuously in the first part of the report that it does, then you will see it within your own buildings, and you'll see it by looking at the relationship between the environments you provide for your people and the ultimate success of the business. Over to you, Michelle, I think, for the next part.
Great, thanks, Richard. So yes, as Richard mentioned, our report was very well received. We were delighted with the media pickup, and right away we started hearing from industry and from green building councils. And we heard a couple of things. One was from other sectors, in particular the retail sector, that there was really a demand for, they wanted some metrics for their own sector, the same way that we created metrics for the office sector. And the other thing we heard was from companies who were actually doing a dive into the metrics that we had created, even from companies, from people who were involved in the creation of the metrics themselves, that sometimes it's not so easy to collect the information. And and so we wanted to really look at those challenges and find a way to help people really make the most use of this metrics that we had given them, and help to continue to really build the business case around this. So starting back in June of this year, we did launch our Better Places for People campaign. You'll see we're lucky to have quite a bit of sponsorship behind us. Those are our sponsors down at the bottom, and all those sponsors participate in our steering committee and are also involved in a number of our working groups in this area. And really the campaign is meant to be around implementation and action. We've got a great report, and we could keep issuing reports, but we want something that's going to help get this work in use and help really make a difference in the marketplace. So the objectives, our mission of the campaign is to create awareness around this issue and to help people live enhance the enhance the lives of all the people that are living and working and playing in these buildings. And our specific things that we're going to do is to create awareness. We're going to continue to develop tools and resources, but very specific ones based on what we're hearing from people in our target audiences and in the building and construction industry that they need to help really implement these metrics and make this business case very real for them. We want to drive collaboration in particular, with our target audiences. And I should stop and pause right here and really say that our target audiences are major tenants of buildings. And we want to really shift the emphasis to the demand side. So how can we change demand for greener, healthier buildings? So major tenants, owners, developers, and investors, and also agents, which are also known as brokers in North America for buildings, the people selling buildings. How can we change the way we talk about it? Of course, we're always going to continue to engage with the building and construction sector, and you'll see that at our the fifth objective down there at the bottom. But we also really want to shift the emphasis to the demand side and start creating more demand for greener, healthier buildings. Another objective for us is to also act as the central hub for our 100-member green building councils around the world for the work that they're doing in this area. So with that, we have launched this campaign. We are focusing on 3 sectors: office, retail, and residential. And right now, I'd really like to talk about the office sector. And I'd like to ask Beth Ambrose from JLL, the chair of our offices working group, to talk to us a bit about the work we're doing around offices. Beth, over to you.
Great, thanks, Michelle, and hello, everyone. So the Offices Working Group was set up in about spring this year and includes participants from a range of organisations, really exciting different companies and organisations actually involved. So range from agents to Google, to the Rocky Mountain Institute, to the Institute of Real Estate Management, and to academics from the US, Australia, and South Africa, various other participants, all bringing a wealth of experience and expertise to the group. Obviously, it's a group with a global remit, so those of us based in London are getting used to 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. calls at the moment. But as Michelle mentioned, the role of our group is envisaged really as developing a work programme which facilitates direct engagement with the leasing and buying decision makers of corporate occupiers of offices. But obviously, it's worth saying that inevitably, as part of that conversation, we engage with agents and investors and developers and landlords as well. They're very keen to find out what occupiers want from their space. The aim of the group is really to increase the long-term adoption of healthier and more productive office buildings. So the idea is that over the year ahead, we are rolling out a framework for engagement, various outputs to support corporate occupiers and the property industry in making decisions that lead towards that aim of adopting healthier buildings. At the moment, we're focused on further developing a really detailed understanding of the common barriers to adopting the recommendations that were laid out in last year's report, and therefore, again, as Michelle mentioned, developing practical outputs that are designed to tackle the really specific barriers for specific roles, so that anyone who wants to implement changes within their work practices or organisations regarding health, wellbeing and productivity performance issues can do that as straightforwardly as possible. So, Michelle, if you could move to the next slide. There are various barriers that we've listed on this slide, and each actor or decision maker in real estate is facing different barriers. So it can appear to add up to a bit of a Gordian knot, to be honest. For example, the first point around time pressures is that most people working in a commercial environment, frankly, don't have time for a trial and error approach that you might use if you're in an academic environment. So trying out new things can be quite a challenge. People want tried and tested, cost-effective, practical solutions. So that's quite tricky when you're embarking on a new area, which is why ancillary working groups like ours are really helpful. We're doing all the trying and testing in the sort of a safe environment, rolling it out through pilot processes so that then once it's tested properly, people can use that with confidence. The second point, raising the danger around short-term thinking, is that we find in the property sector that upfront costs rather than long-term cost savings or value generation often hold quite high sway in decision-making of corporate real estate teams, and the design and build teams have an even greater challenge in that the additional upfront costs then need to be recompensed by higher asset value to make their jobs commercially viable, which requires that occupiers are willing to pay more for the asset. And that, in its turn, requires that developers need to provide sufficient explanation to occupiers regarding the building's attributes that will positively increase their staff's productivity, so that they are willing to pay more for that. So that is one of the tricky barriers to overcome. And then from speaking with colleagues in our GEL agency teams in London, certainly, but also in other countries, demand from occupiers can be quite inconsistent, or can come across as that, at least as the information or the requirements filter through to the agents and the owners, because the HR and sustainability teams, who would actually have quite strong opinions on various things around this area, are not necessarily educated on the nuances around real estate. They're not always involved at the cutting edge of decisions, and the CRE team's decision making can also be led by a fairly common belief flowing down from the CFO or the board that real estate is more a cost to be minimised rather than a potentially huge area of value creation. But I would say that companies like Google obviously famously think very differently about that, and you can see that in the sort of space that they're developing and occupying at the moment. Also, another challenge for agents is that the issues that occupiers would be interested in aren't necessarily grouped neatly in marketing materials or in the conversations they have with their agents under this banner of health, wellbeing and productivity. So and one of the other challenges that agents face is that there's limited hard evidence in financial terms at the moment, although of course the business case work that WGBC has done has helped with that, but the hard evidence of impact on well-being makes agents quite nervous. They don't want to emphasise aspects that they can't then prove. So the more information and case studies they can point to, the more comfortable they feel with explaining the benefits that would come from a labelled sort of healthy and productive asset. And then one final point around the valuing process. They're obviously, the valuation teams are currently restricted on putting high values on assets with strong health, well-being and productivity characteristics until those values are reflected in the market. So the valuers can only mark to the market. They can only give a value on something that is seen clearly in a transaction. So without full transparency of information, that's very tricky for them. So all of this is to say that it leads to quite an unclear view of occupier and market expectations in the area. And there's also a sort of lack of clarity, in particular on the link to value creation for any of the parties involved. So this final point on the side around the tick box approach, I think sustainability in general can be seen as quite a bit of a tick box exercise by owners and investors if there isn't that clear link to value creation. So what we want to be able to do is to help the different teams within corporate occupiers and the various other different actors in the property sector influencing workplace decision making, understand what evidence they can gather and practically how to best undertake those data collection processes, and then close the loop by feeding the findings back through to new location decisions and office designs and the monitoring processes. So the slide that's currently showing illustrates the many different departments in a corporate occupying firm that have relevance and influence in, well, to some extent or another, over the workplace's physical environment. So HR and sustainability, the FM teams and the CRE team, obviously the board and CFO making the financial decisions. Importantly, also the building users, who are quite rarely consulted actually, or far more rarely than you'd think, in terms of what they're looking for from their space or what they need from their space. And that's a really important point to bear in mind, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. We're really looking at how to bring those groups closer together and ideally get them to work together to combine forces, as well as connecting much better with the owners and their property managers, and then the design build teams and the agents, so the sort of ancillary groups of support within the property sector. So they all need to be involved in the conversation together. Very rarely, in my experience, have all those groups been together in the same room. Probably never, actually. So that's one of the important factors that we're working through with our office's working group. So, given the sort of various barriers that I highlighted on the previous slide, there are a number of practical outputs that we believe would be very useful for our group to produce and make available publicly on the website for the Better Places for People campaign. So the list of deliverables that we're working towards includes this month's air quality testing guidance for facilities and property managers, and a really interesting case study on British Land's headquarters refurbishment, including the various pre-assessments that were carried out that Richard is going to talk through in a couple of slides' time. And then next month, we'll be releasing employee survey guidance and links to sample surveys for use by both HR teams and landlord teams. And that's particularly to this point around making sure that you're connecting with and absorbing information from the actual building users to see how the asset's performing in practice. And then going forward, over the next few months, we'll be issuing various office design guidance aspects for designers and the CRE team. So that might include design guidance to incorporate greater levels of biophilic design into the space, sample client briefs for the CRE teams to give designers, checklists and due diligence work, again for CRE teams to use in discussions with investors and agents, so to make sure that the best possible information is being shared with the agents. Also guidance on overcoming the challenges in data collection for human resources and the COO or CFO. There are all sorts of aspects and technical trickiness that comes up when you try and do this in practice. And then help for the CRE team who are trying to incorporate a more strategic approach to all of this, not just the practical day-to-day aspects of real estate management, but actually how to get board buy-in for a well-being strategy, for example. And as well as these particular outputs, we plan to issue, and are already, of course, issuing practical case studies to illustrate the evidence from those that are already implementing the framework and using the WGBC findings, and to make sure we spread the word amongst the sector to, providing a platform for corporate occupiers who are driving this agenda to promote what they are doing. And then final couple of points to flag that there are tools, of course, out there already in the public arena that enable high-level benchmarking of data that's already been collected by occupants. I'm thinking about the ARUP Building User Survey, the Leesman Index, and there's also a Berkeley University database, probably about 1 million responses and surveys. So those sort of tools are really helpful for people to see how their building is performing compared to others. And then we've also been discussing in our group whether we could widen the range of certifications and labels available at the moment and bring more into Europe, because we're aware of the WELL certification, obviously, in the US. It is international, it's coming over to Europe now, but quite slowly. Or a Healthy Companies Index. There's a healthy buildings label based out in South Africa that, for example, could be used in Europe. So those sort of aspects, I think, labelling space and making it very clear and simple for sort of occupiers and agents and landlords to understand how to best communicate the performance of their asset is really important. Much like we had with LEED and BREEAM and Energy Star, it really helps people to understand the performance of the asset that they're looking at. So moving on to the first of our outputs, the air quality monitoring guidance, Richard is going to talk through that for us now. So Michelle, thank you. Move to the next slide. That's great. I'll just hand over to Richard.
Great. Thank you very much, Beth. And while we're waiting for that slide to queue up, this is just one example of the kind of tools that we're trying to put out. The first one that we've done for the offices is around air quality, and no doubt many of you on the line will have heard a lot about VOCs and particularly CO2. Most recently, a number of studies have come out just in the last month or so equating poor performance with high CO2 levels. Before I get into the content of the brief itself, and it is on the campaign website for you to read, Beth is mentioning a number of barriers around the industry to getting this kind of work put into place. But actually, the image that we see is quite telling. You can see there that the person is looking at what seems to be a mobile phone, and what that is another way of saying that actually that there are lots of barriers which are being removed by technology. So in this slide, and the one that follows, it's becoming increasingly easier for the average occupant to both know the quality of the environment and actually to report the quality of that environment out to others, which has all kinds of commercial ramifications around things like due diligence and rent reviews. So in the British land case study, which I'll mention in just a minute, it's very easy for organizations without tapping into landlord services to buy very, very low-cost environmental monitors, which are increasingly on the market, and a number of companies are doing this here in Europe and certainly in the U.S., and allowing employees or other members of the organization to know exactly what's happening in their environment. So it's very easy. It's very simple for individuals, ordinary individuals, using the cell phone or a mobile phone or a tablet and a very, very low-cost device monitor to understand increasingly more about their environment. And this is all taking place in a much larger context where individuals are more interested in understanding about what affects their health and well-being. Certainly we've seen this in terms of food and nutrition, and we think it's only a matter of time before the interest that people have with what they put into their bodies becomes much larger to what is around their bodies. And it's the kind of thing where technology is enabling ordinary individuals the kind of access to information that they didn't have even just a couple of years ago. If we go to the next slide, there's a sort of specific example of this. And it's worth mentioning that there's a certification that we're looking at quite closely as part of our international group called RESET, which basically it's a certification in which organizations, it's coming out of China and the Hong Kong area, agree to make public the information that's available about the quality of the indoor spaces. And here you can see obviously carbon dioxide, which is a natural pollutant, which tends to, as the slide indicates, be the consequence of great densities or lack of ventilation. This is the kind of thing which the environmental monitors, which again are available as the air quality brief makes clear, to ordinary organizations to just begin to put into their environments and to be able to chart this. Now it's very interesting. You can see that there's a sort of natural cycle. You can see when there are more people and less fresh air, and I think importantly for this, this kind of data can be tracked, and as part of the RESET certification, people can see this, and our contacts who are looking at this quite closely have unequivocally said that occupants who are choosing places to work in places like China, where the outdoor air quality is a concern, are beginning to choose where they work and whom they work for based on some kind of this evidence. And increasingly, we're beginning to hear about this in Europe. There are a number of apps which are allowing homeowners to understand what the air quality is in their specific street, by their house. And so it's another way of saying that an issue which was a little bit remote to people, even just a couple of years ago, is now much more tangible. It's the kind of information that people can track and report, and they can use this information in the same way that they've used information around poor or good building performance, and it's just another tool that's available to individuals for them to begin to understand a little bit better about what's going on in their offices. Michelle, if you can move to the next slide. There is a case study on the campaign where this was done by British Land, who followed essentially the guidance of the report to a T. So where the report recommended that organizations appoint a well-being executive to begin to look at the framework, the physical, the perceptual, and the financial. British Land have done that. What they did in this case study was they took some benchmark readings using some of the monitors I just spoke about to understand the environment, the physical environment as pre-refurb. They also did a perceptual study so that they could understand how people felt about the environment. And ultimately what they did was to look at their numbers around absenteeism, retention, revenue, medical complaints, and costs. And what they've done going forward is they've refurbished the space, and now they're just at the point now where they're going back and they're conducting these tests all over again. So they're taking new readings of the environment, which are showing improvement. They're undergoing a perception study where they're finding that people are reporting a higher satisfaction with the workplace. And what they'll ultimately do is they'll see over time, because it's a little bit early for them to do this, whether there is an improvement in in absenteeism, in staff retention, in a reduction in medical costs and complaints. And so far, it seems to suggest, based on some of the physical and the perceptual that we've seen, that we might be able to expect that to come true as well. But essentially, what this is a case study which has taken the framework, have implemented in what we think is the best case to do this, because refurbishment holds everything else constant except for what's been done to the building, and it allows companies like British Land and others who engage with this to quantify the consequences of the changes that they've made. And this is quite unique, and to learn, and so that the British Land and other companies can begin to see what works for them, what doesn't work for them in their own offices, and they can begin to roll this out as they begin to develop additional properties. If we can move on to the next slide, I'd like to introduce the work of retail, if I might. And just as this is being queued up, just a little background on this. The office's report had a great reception, as I mentioned earlier in the call. It didn't take very long for retailers to start calling and saying, we know that the difficulty of measuring productivity in a modern office. It's very difficult. And when we were looking at the metrics to measure productivity, when we were putting together the report last fall, we understood this. Retailers began to call shortly towards the beginning of October last year, and they said, actually, what retail can do to supplement the office's work is provide very, very detailed guidance and very, very detailed data around productivity, because actually that's what retail does probably better than any other sector. So what we tried to do to see in adapting the office's framework to retail, just how much of it would carry over. And I won't jump to the next slide just yet, but I can assure you that actually something quite revealing happened. We found that the environmental factors that we considered in the office were as pertinent or more pertinent to retail. We realized that we could continue to measure a limited number of environmental factors. So there are 10, 9 of which were incorporated in the office's framework. The perceptual study that we asked organizations to conduct to see how their workers felt about the environment could easily be applied to customers in the retail setting. And I think the biggest argument for doing retail was simply the value proposition. So when we're talking about absenteeism and medical costs and medical complaints, these are costs to an organization. What retail does, it opens up a new category of value. And if you think about it, step back from it for just a second, you realize actually that if you can understand why customers shop and behave as they do, that's far more telling, or potentially far more telling than office workers who might join an organization for all kinds of reasons. But there's a free agency to customers in the retail setting, which begins to just illuminate quite how important the environment that's provided is for shaping behavior. If we can, there we go. Thanks, Michelle. You'll see there on the left-hand side the environmental factors, which we call the physical factors in the office report. They look very much the same. The additional one is the community space, because shopping centers and retail tend to have much more of that involved in their projects. The experience you can see there is what we call the perceptual. It looks very much the same without dwelling too much on this. I should say also that the important part of this, which we've always encouraged organizations to do, but particularly true with retail, is to begin to quantify and to monetize a relationship which is quite clear to retailers. So retailers are very much on the ball about knowing that the environment affects the experience, which affects the economics. And what we're asking retailers to do in this particular framework is actually to work the other way. So rather than telling them, as we did also in offices, don't look at these environmental features in the abstract. Think about them in terms of the success of your business, because retailers will very much know which stores are performing particularly well. And if you get the right people in the room, as increasingly is happening through the development of our framework, you're recognizing that they're finding an environmental component as well. So sometimes in organizations, the people who are responsible for the financial side aren't as in touch as they might be with the people who are, for example, on the FM side. And so it's very important for people who know about the impact of the building to also be talking to people who understand the impact of business. If we can move to the next slide, Michelle. Excuse me. And you'll see in the next slide that we're putting together some deliverables around the retail as well. One of the more interesting ones on the left-hand side is exactly what's available using this new technology, as I alluded to in the offices, about people broadcasting what it's like in physical environments. We've detected that what can be a costly exercise, post-occupancy evaluation, is actually freely available if you are clued into social media, and if you look at things like TripAdvisor and Twitter. It's very easy to be able to rank, to environmentally map places by what people are saying about them. And on the right-hand side is a study which is put together by M&S. I would encourage you to read it, which talks about exactly how to implement this framework within organizations to be able to see the demonstrated effect of a positive environment on a positive business case. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Richard. The last sector we'd like to talk about today before we go into our question and answer period is residential. And so residential, there was strong interest from our entire steering committee in really addressing this sector. And we think it's going to be both very interesting and quite challenging. So if you think about the nature of residential development globally, it varies, right? It varies not only by who owns the buildings, typically who builds them, by building type, the character and nature of the building, density, relationship to cities, the economics of a particular country. So there's huge variation. But what we found as we've been scoping this work over the recent months is that we actually believe that there are some design, we understand there are design principles that are really universal. So if you think about some of those principles that even we flashed just a couple of slides ago on retail about those kinds of things, good amounts of natural light, things like thermal comfort, acoustics, all of those things are the domain of everyone. They shouldn't be relevant to people that live in an urban versus a suburban area versus a developed or a developing economy. These are principles of good design. Now, how they get developed and how they get integrated and perceptions of these things, of course, vary from place to place. But to have an overarching sense of design principles is something that we definitely want to talk about. So we anticipate that we'll be preparing something a little more similar to the health, well-being, and productivity in offices report, the first section that really spoke about design and some basic strategies to achieve good design and any compromises that might have to be made with regard to things like the energy efficiency, where that's the case. So that's something that we're looking at for this next phase. We will be kicking this off in the next few months with working groups, getting lots of international input because residential development is so wide-ranging. But what we've heard both from our member councils and from industry everywhere is that this would be incredibly valuable. And we also think it's a really great way to reach an even wider audience around the benefits of green building. But of course, the question comes back to is how do we relate this back to the business case? And a question we're asking right now is, how much do people know about the impact of their physical environment on their health and well-being? As Richard pointed out, when talking about retail, there are lots of and offices. There are now ways to test and measure indoor environment quality. You could go online right now. You could go to Amazon today and order something that'll tell you about the indoor environment quality of your home and feed you that information to your phone. And we're actually seeing the largest amount of growth in indoor air quality testing in this consumer area space. So we do think that people are beginning to get an understanding of this, and like with all things, technology is changing that awareness. The next question is, of course, does that translate into what people are willing to pay for that? Does it change what they would pay for rent? Does it change what they would pay in sales price? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But does it change the value? Is it going to be more attractive? Is it going to increase, is it going to create strong incentives for developers to be conscious of these kinds of design features as they are building development? And I do, of course, want to emphasize that, although we're taking on the huge task of taking on global residential development, we are talking specifically about the formal sector. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions. We did have a couple of questions come through already. I have a stack of questions that I want to ask, that I'd like to ask Richard and Beth, but I encourage you to ask any questions that you might have made note of during this conversation and during the and that come up during this. So I'd like to start with one of the questions that came through in the question box, which was with regard to legislation and regulation. Beth, I think in particular, the question was around the workplace influencer slide. And I'd be interested to hear from both of you as to whether or not you think legislation is something that we're going to be seeing in this area with regard to kind of the indoor environmental quality. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's possibly quite likely that the process of legislation around the sustainability area in general tends to flow in a specific way, which is that a social concern is raised, agitated about by quite a few people on the sort of fringes. That becomes a mainstream concern. Then that starts giving rise to voluntary commitments and labelling and so on, and then that moves into legislation. Now, we've already got to the point of having the WELL certification label, so I could imagine the next step being legislative requirements on top of that, which already exist, of course, in terms of the health and safety and building regulations that we have. I think that academic and commercial research tends to be quite in advance of legislation, so the consciousness at the moment in the medical profession as well, which hasn't yet really filtered through into the property world, is that there's a lot of long-term chronic health problems that the population is facing, like asthma, like diabetes, and so on, which, given that we spend 90% of our time indoors, at least in the West and the North, in buildings, that the property sector has a huge influence on the potential morbidity or improvement in levels of morbidity amongst our population. So I could imagine that governments will look at the evidence that we have in front of them and looking forward 5, 10, 20, 25 years, 30 years, thinking, aha, now this is the sector that actually could do most to, as well as the food and beverage sector, could do the most to help people actually improve their health and well-being. And so therefore we think it's incumbent upon us as legislators to put things in place which will promote active design, for example, taking the stairs, reduce the amount of lifts, improve indoor air quality. We've got to consider air pollution that Richard was talking about earlier. In London, it's absolutely appalling that, we breach our levels of air pollution thresholds that the EU has set for us probably 50% of the year. So we've got to do something about that. And obviously all that air is being sucked through into the building. As much as there are filters on some of those unpleasant chemicals, some of that's still coming in. So I think there's a huge realm of possibility that legislation could really help in this area. Not to overburden the sector, but just to say actually the standards we've been working to were probably set back in the 1970s, and we need to up our game now.
Great, thank you. I think those are all really good points, and I really like your analysis of the going kind of a fringe agitators issue to the mainstream, to labels, and then eventually to legislation. And I guess a further point, just into the questioner's question about, difficult that might be. I don't think as part of this campaign, we're going to agitate for specific legislation, but much like we've seen with green building rating tools, which I know green building rating tools encompass most of the design features that we have been talking about in the last report and the current one. And in some cases, those do get taken up by, say, municipalities, for incentives or as for regulation. I think we'll see more of that. I think what we're going to see is just a shift in emphasis, mostly about the way we talk about this, because many of these issues they've been in green building rating tools for a long time. We just haven't spoken about the human benefits. We've focused primarily on the environmental benefits. While we've got your attention on the line and we're talking more about, I'd like to kind of dig a little bit into the offices sector. And we talked about, we had that really helpful slide that you guys have been working on with the different influencers and, in getting some of those teams engaged. And you talked about the challenges of like getting all the people in the room. If somebody's out there, they're in a tenancy right now, at a company in a big tenancy, and they're looking at wanting to really shift this discussion. You and Rich, I'd like to hear from you on like, where do they get started? What's a way to start with getting people engaged or to kind of bring up this issue in the context of their work?
Sure. I mean, if I go first, I suppose the first thing to ask is, well, depending on your own role, I suppose you'll have more of a sense of this or less. But what in the current decision-making process, how does that currently work, and who's currently involved? And I've found just going to speak to those people and setting up a meeting to incorporate the people that are making the decisions and the other people in other departments that you think would be interested in that decision, getting them together, and then helping to facilitate that conversation. So much comes out of it. I mean, we had a meeting the other day actually with a client, a large banking client, and they'd never all got together before in the same room, HR and CRE and FM, and just in that one conversation, so many things came to light that they didn't realize about each other's roles or the decisions that were being made and the implications of those decisions. So just getting people together really helps. And then I think a second easy win is just to connect with the HR team about the next time they're doing an employee satisfaction survey, to bring in more of those questions around satisfaction with the workplace environment and how productive people have been and how much absenteeism there have been. That's really helpful, and you just start getting this feedback from the building occupants. And then I think one final point, actually, which is helpful, is to look at the absenteeism stats and think about some of the evidence that the WGBC report has provided to us. And one stat that sticks in my mind from research that was done was that the amount of sick days that the average employee takes a year is about 4.5, and each of those costs something like an average of £250 or £300 per person per day to the company. But regular cyclists only take half as many sick days. Now, that's the sort of information that a CRE team can then think, all right, so that means we need to make sure we provide lots of cycle facilities for people who want to cycle to encourage that uptake. It just means that HR can issue kind of emails and communications to staff to say, look, we're promoting a cycling processes and facilities for you, and we're also going to help you by providing some kind of funding initiative so that you can buy a bike at a subsidy. It's things like that that then cut your sick leave costs in half for the company if everybody was to cycle, which of course probably they wouldn't, but a much larger majority might. That's the sort of stuff that then gets up to the CFO quite quickly, because he's noticed that suddenly absenteeism is cut by 50%. So it's sort of small things, small quite simple things, I think actually have quite huge implications further down the line. But Richard might also have some points on this.
Yeah, Richard, you have some thoughts on where to get started? I mean, Beth has some really great first steps there. Do you have any thoughts on that, or maybe easy wins for companies? Richard?
Was that a question for me, Michelle? Sorry.
Yes, sorry. I'm sorry. Yes, it was. Do you have...
No. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes.
No, that's fine. I do, and I would encourage, again, people to visit the campaign website, where the retail group has put together a guidance note on 5 ways to engage with this agenda, and that is easily adaptable to the office framework as well. What I would say for companies getting started on this is an accessible agenda, and the report was written to be accessible as well. And while we've tried to keep the number of metrics limited, there are always all different kinds of ways to take on this. So, for example, if you're an investor, you may not have all the information about employees. You may not have any of the information around absenteeism or turnover or anything like that. But what you will likely have is access to a building log, by which you can get one simple metric in in the report, which is called physical complaints. And say you have 100 buildings as opposed to one, you can very easily use that little bit of information to whittle down very, very quickly the kind of assets that you might want to look at a bit more closely. And so, while we would like everybody to engage with the framework, and there are a number of companies that are doing this, there's a little bit in here for everybody. And so it's quite possible for an HR or an FM person to begin to leverage the information they have should they want to have a wider role in the company. But ultimately, I think it does come down to having leaders, getting people, as Beth mentioned quite rightly, into the room. We've done this as well, and an afternoon of looking at this, of looking at data which is already within companies. We say this in the report. Companies are literally sitting on a treasure trove of information about their two most expensive items, people and places. And very seldom do companies begin to filter their financial performance by their environmental performance. And once they begin to do that with the right people in the room, it yields some very, very big dividends.
Great, thank you so much, Richard. Also, thanks for calling attention to the valuable resources on the website. And there is a really great document really explaining that retail metrics framework that you would have seen earlier in the presentation. It really giving you 5 steps to pick it up and start using it. And then there's a accompanying case study on Ecosol Road, which will be uploaded later today. It talks about one particular company, Marks and Spencer, and how they were using this in their own assets. And Richard, while we have you, I wanted to also ask you a question that came up around retail, and you can speak to this as well as I could. So I'll ask you. There's a kind of a timeline about some of the work around retail. Do you want to, Beth kind of went over some of the different items that the office group would be producing. Do you want to talk about kind of the planned work for the retail group and when it will all be released? Hi, Richard.
Sure. What we're doing with that is, yep. Can you hear me okay, Michelle?
Yes, I can now. Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Hi. Okay, thanks. Now, what we're doing with this now is obviously there's a UK task group which has been responsible for doing much of the work around the framework. There's also an international retail group which is feeding into this as well and providing us around the international experience on this. Both of those groups are currently submitting case studies, as you mentioned, Michelle. We'll continue to put those on at the average, every couple of months kind of a thing. We're going to be looking at our interim results of all the companies who are involved with this, who have implemented the framework. We'll be looking at that and releasing some cases and some documents in November. And ultimately, what we'll be doing is putting this together, a compendium of all the information and all the tools that we've gathered. And we'll be rolling that out in an event in the very, very beginning of February.
Great, thank you.
So there's plenty of time. Should you have a case study, should you want to become involved, to please get in touch with us, because we'd like to have more information on that if we can from people who are listening.
I'd also think this is a good time to really talk about how you can get involved in this campaign. So you can continually find out information from us on our website. You see the web address there. We have a Facebook page. And we actually have a lot of really great information on our Facebook page, including different reports and interesting things that we find coming out. We post on there. We don't have very many followers, and it's really a shame because there's so much good information on that page. So we encourage you to join us on Facebook. You can also, and that's at Better Places for People, the World GBC Twitter feed. We post a lot of stuff on there. Look for our hashtag Better Places for People. And also, we are making this, we do this work for you to be better enable you to use this information. So if you have topics and resources you think would be really helpful for us to produce, please email us at the website you see there. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for joining us. And thanks very much to Richard and to Beth for your fantastic information. And we hope to see you all and hear from you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.